So what can we do to help students with contextual factors that seem beyond our control as teachers? In the last lecture video that I made for you, we talked about different contextual factors that we need to consider in making accommodations for our students. And we looked at individual student needs, we looked at the communities, we looked at the school and the layout and things like that, and looked at all the different factors that there are. But today we're going to talk more generally about what can we do to get to know our students, to better understand their situations, to know how to best support them at home and at school. So let's flip on over to the slides. And we'll start with this. What are the contextual factors that you think have the greatest factor on how students learn? I want you to be thinking about this throughout this lecture video because we're going to have, there is research, and we'll talk about that, but there are differences depending on our own situation, our own biases, our own perspectives. And some of the contextual factors are different from community to community, certainly from country to country, and we're going to talk about that as well. So I want you to think about which factors impact learning the most and what experiences you've had observing teachers accommodating students with those situations. One of the questions that I often get is, Mr. C, what factors do you think are most important? And I do think that this depends on the community, it depends on the environment. But for me personally, we know from research that the socioeconomic level has a great impact on the support that students get at home. You know, if they can afford to go to summer school or to be involved in extracurriculars, or if their parents are home instead of working all the time, right? So when they come home from school, our parents there, those are huge factors. But I think a related factor that we don't talk about very much is simply the relationship between parents and their child. So regardless of their financial situation, are there people who are very poor whose parents are incredibly supportive and there for their children? Yes, and so I think that has the greatest impact on a student's ability to learn in the classroom is, do they feel their parents care about them and are there for them, right? And this I'm drawing from the research I do on happiness. When we want to know what are the greatest factors for long-term happiness and for health, it is the quality of your relationships, your personal relationships. And that applies to students as well. If a student wants to have success, they need to have close personal relationships that are positive. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're buddy-buddy with their parents, but it means they know that they can count on them, that they have a support system at home. And if something's going wrong, that they can turn to somebody. Now, if they don't have that, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, can they get some of that in the classroom? And obviously the answer to that is yes, but it's not the same. Okay, so here is a quote that I love. We, in my class, we read a chapter about different contextual factors, and the authors said this in that textbook chapter. When kids are loved at home, they come to school to learn. Other kids who aren't loved come to school to be loved. And I 100% agree with this statement. I feel like it's fairly universal. If a student feels like they're loved, then their potential at school is so much higher. If they're not feeling loved and supported, then they're going to seek that, and sometimes seek that in very negative ways, right? So they're going to misbehave so that they get attention, because even negative attention is attention, right? Students want attention, whether that be positive or negative. Now, ideally, they would get positive attention at home. If they don't, then hopefully they're getting positive attention at school. And if they don't feel like they're getting positive attention at school, they're probably going to seek negative attention. So one of the things that we can focus on as teachers is, how do we give them positive attention? Now, I've considered this because obviously as an elementary school teacher, I saw this all the time, but people have asked me, is this a big issue in college? So I want you to think about that. Does this apply to kids in all situations? Does it apply to a PE classroom? Does it apply to a woodshop classroom? Does it apply to the workforce? So maybe we're not talking about schools at all. How important is it that people feel loved and supported? And I think you'll agree with me that it applies everywhere, right? When I see the success of my students here at the university, I could probably name that as the number one factor to their success. Do they feel loved and supported? And if not, unfortunately, what we see often in higher education, if a student doesn't feel supported and they're in elementary school, they'll shut down, they'll be quiet, or they'll misbehave, right? If a student doesn't feel loved and supported in college, they don't go to class, right? They're not going to school, so you don't even see them at all. And if you do, they might seem a little bit more introverted or shut down in different ways. But often they just don't respond to emails anymore. They don't respond to classroom communications, and they're not showing up to class. So it becomes much more difficult in college. So our goal here in college is let's create a supportive community right away at the beginning of the semester. So if students are struggling, they can turn to other classmates, so they can turn to the teacher, and that makes a difference. But I feel like this applies universally. People want to feel loved and supported. All right, so this is a question I commonly get in this area. What if the students don't want to get to know you and they don't want you to get to know them? So as far as supporting them, they're going through something, maybe something traumatic in their life. Their parents are getting divorced. There's some sort of neglect or abuse, or maybe they're struggling with mental health issues or physical disability, but they really don't care about you as a teacher and they don't want you to be involved in this, right? So what can you do? Well, the first thing is you want to show them that you do care about them. And you show that by listening to them. You show that by trying to get to know them. And you show that by having a safe classroom environment where maybe they're not talking to you, but they can feel safe talking to a classmate or to a small group of students. And so creating that safe environment comes first, right? Where students feel valued, they feel like they're being heard. And it doesn't matter how different they are. It doesn't matter what experiences they're going through. Everyone deserves to feel loved and supported. And we don't even have to agree with everything that's happening in their lives or not happening in their lives or decisions they've made. We don't have to agree with or support those kinds of things, but we can love and support them as individuals. So that's where it starts. Now, can you get to know your students better if they don't want to get to know you? Yeah, and it comes with trying to get to know all your students. If you have periodic pullouts where you talk to all your students individually, maybe that's a parent-teacher conference or just a teacher conference where you're out in the hallway and just checking in with your students. Maybe it's happening during recess or during lunch where you're walking around and you're just getting to know your students, asking them questions, finding out how they're doing. Those things make a difference. And even when you're doing that for someone else, if a student sees you making an effort to get to know students generally, they're probably more likely to want to get to know you too, right? And so I think that works both ways. This is, again, human nature. If we're not feeling loved and supported, most people want to have some kind of human connection. And so it takes effort, and we work at it. And so, keep working at it, and hopefully you make progress, but also know that sometimes students aren't going to open up to you, and hopefully they'll open up to someone else, maybe another student, maybe another teacher, maybe a therapist at your school or some other resource that you have. But just know that it doesn't always work, despite your best efforts as a teacher. And don't beat yourself up about it, but do make an effort to reach every student. All right, now I get this question more here in higher education than I did in the elementary classroom or in the middle school or high school classroom. But the idea here is in other countries, maybe teachers don't get to know their students, and what are the pros and cons of that, right? So I've actually taught hundreds of international students over the years, some in the K-12 level, but mostly in higher education, and I've even taught classes that were only international students. I taught a welcome to the United States or an introduction to United States education, right, with students from China and from other countries. And so when we look at the differences between American education or U.S. education and international education, first let's recognize that all countries are different. So I can't generalize here and say all teachers are this way or that way, because it really does depend on where you're at. And even in that place, not every teacher in the United States is the same, right? So some teachers make a bigger effort to get to know students and others maybe not so much. But what I can say generally is at least based on the conversations I've had with students, teachers in the United States make a much greater effort to get to know their students, both inside and outside the classroom. We're more involved in the communities. We interact with students outside of the classroom more often, and certainly we make that more of a priority, generally speaking. Now, what are the pros and cons of that? Well, I believe that one of the greatest benefits of getting to know your students is that you enjoy teaching more and that you make a greater impact, right? So most of us went into teaching so that we can make an impact, so we could change lives. And that comes through getting to know our students. Now, if teaching is just a job, then getting to know your students probably isn't as important. If it's just a paycheck, it probably doesn't matter very much, right? And so a lot of this depends on your why. But if you are an international teacher or in a situation where maybe the culture at your school is teachers are very formal and they don't have interactions with the students, do what is appropriate. In the schools I've taught at, there were some schools that were very informal, yet I still prefer to have my students call me Mr. C and not Tyler. That's not because I'm not trying to get to know them or because I dislike them or anything. It's because when students call me Mr. C, it's very endearing to me because I love being a teacher, and that's how I identify, is as Mr. C. And so I love that, and it's not a slight on my students or on myself. It doesn't mean that I can't have a less formal relationship with them, and certainly after they've left my classroom, that we can't have relationships that persist. But I like to be called Mr. C, and so that's how I have my students call me. At least that's my preference. So just a little bit of thoughts there on international education. Another related question here is whether it's international students or students who are different from us because of a disability or some impairment to their learning, is how can we get to know those students if we've never been part of that world, right? So in the case of international students, how can I understand Chinese students if I've never been to China? How can I understand, people with physical disabilities if I've never had that disability? How can I understand my students whose parents are going through a divorce because my parents are happily married? So that's really difficult. Now, there are some things that we can do. The first thing is we can talk to our students, right? Get to know them. Ask them to teach us about it. I think I mentioned this in my last lecture, but just this week, as we were talking about these different situations that might arise, I had a student who's had a traumatic brain injury ask me, what can you do to make accommodations for students with TBI? And my response was, I don't know. I've actually never dealt with that. But apparently the student has TBI, and so I asked him, what can you tell me about this? What would make me a better teacher? What are things that I should know? And so it can start by simply talking to your students and getting to know your students and asking them for ideas. We also live in a world that is full of information, right? So I can Google it. I can watch YouTube videos about this different culture or this different aspect to learning. I can watch movies. I can read books. I can go to websites. And most of those things don't take a lot of additional effort. We're now transitioning into a world where AI can really assist in this way. So I can go to ChatGPT or some other AI model and say, hey, I don't really understand this, but I have a student in this situation. Can you tell me or give me some ideas for what I might do in the classroom to better accommodate this particular student? And AI is going to give you some great suggestions. So there is so much that we can do right now. Now, the other thing that I love to do, and I feel like this is beneficial to the whole class, which is let's invite those students to share with all of us, not just with the teacher. So let's have a culture day where students talk about their backgrounds. If we're dealing with other learning disabilities, when appropriate, and so we can talk to students first and say, hey, would you be comfortable sharing this with the classroom? I know one of my favorite movies, and it's based on a true story, but I'm sure it's a Hollywood version, is Front of the Class, where it talks about a student who has Tourette syndrome. and the principal brings them up in an assembly to address Tourette's with the whole school, which I felt was inappropriate. I'm like, there's a better way to do this. It felt awkward in the movie, but I believe when I read the book, that same book in front of the class, that it was handled a little bit more delicately, and I think there's a lot we can do to share things about ourselves. It might require us to be a little bit vulnerable, but if it's mutually beneficial to the whole classroom, let's do that and look for opportunities to do things like that. All right. Now, as we're wrapping up, I wanted to share with you just one thing that I do with my students, and you can sprinkle things like this periodically throughout the year. You can do this at K-12, you can do it at in higher education, but this idea was I just did an exit ticket or a reflection at the end of class where I asked just this one question: what's one detail about your life that if the teacher understood it, they could be a better instructor for you? And I'm always surprised when I ask this question. I probably should do it more often, but students surprisingly open up a lot when you ask them to open up, right? And so they'll say, I'm overwhelmed because I'm working several jobs, or my parents are going through this situation, or I just had a death in the family and it's really throwing me off. Things like that come up all the time. So in a typical class, if I ask this question, I'll get over a 50% response rate. So if this is optional, they're not getting points. Or you can answer this and say, well, no, there's really nothing I want to tell you, and that's fine. But most of my students do tell me something. And as I noted here, this is a slide I actually use with one of my face-to-face classes, and I just note, hey, I genuinely like to know, so if you include that, that would be really great. And my students by this point know I do genuinely care about them, and I do genuinely want to know. And if you tell me these things, it might impact how I make accommodations for you in the classroom, and I might be a better teacher because of it. And so this can go a real long way. Finally, and I'm not going to answer the student questions here, but what I want to note is that I've started responding to my students' questions with video shorts, and they're tagged to this particular lecture. So I'll make a playlist that will be like contextual factors. So if you want to search on the channel for contextual factors, you're going to find a playlist that has this lecture, the previous lecture that also dealt with contextual factors, and then you'll see a bunch of videos that are dealing with specific questions. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. This is something that I'm trying out. I don't know if it will be helpful or not, but I suspect it will be. And if you have questions based on this lecture or anything related to contextual factors, you don't have to raise your hand. You can go ahead and put those in the comments, and then I'll include a video short for that and tag it to this video as well. So I would love for you to be engaged here and involved with this material. So let me know, and if this is helpful, like it, share it, do all those kinds of things. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.